Good morning and good afternoon to our invitees from the UK. I'm Kathleen Stephenson, the GIC board chair, and I have the great pleasure to welcome Professor Charles Goodhart and Dr. Manoj Pradhan to today's event. Charles Goodhart is a member of the Financial Markets Group at the London School of Economics, having previously, that is from 1987 to 2005, been its deputy director. Since 1985, until his retirement in 2002, he had been the Norman Sosnow Professor of Banking and Finance at the LSE. Professor Goodhart also served as a member of the Bank of England Monetary Policy Committee, and that's until 2000, and between 2002 and 2004, he was an advisor to the Bank of England governor on financial stability. In 1990, he was elected fellow of the British Academy, and needless to say, he has published numerous articles and books, notably on monetary history. He and Manoj Pradhan are the co-authors of the most recent book, The Great Demographic Reversal, Aging Societies, Waning Inequality, and an Inflation Revival, which they will be presenting and discussing today. But before that, the GIC would want to recognize Professor Goodhart's immense contribution to the field of economics and beyond. To this end, I am delighted and truly honored to present to you, Professor Goodhart, with the Frederick Heldring Award for Global Leadership. This award, named after Frederick Heldring, founder of the Global Interdependence Center in 1976 and chair until 2000, is presented to individuals who have demonstrated an exemplary commitment to the development of international relations, trade, and global citizenship. You're actually joining quite a distinguished group that includes Eric Rosengren, whom we all know is the president and CEO of the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston, and he was a recipient in 2018. Catherine Mann, who was a recipient in 2016 when she was the chief economist of the OECD, and she's currently the global chief economist of Citi. Thomas Keane, former governor of the state of New Jersey, a recipient in 2011, and in 2008, the late Martin Feldstein, whom we all know was professor of economics at Harvard. And that's just to cite a few. So a big congratulations to you, Professor Goodhart.
Thank you very, very much indeed. You may actually think that I am the first non-American to have got your award, but you would actually only be half right, because my father came from a distinguished New York family. My grandmother was actually one of the Lehman family, and the Goodhart family originated from the Netherlands, where they were a Dutch Jewish family who emigrated to Cincinnati in the middle of the 19th century. And from there, my great-grandfather returned to New York, where he worked in the financial field and actually received an honor for developing the bond market in New York. My father grew up in New York, went to Yale, and was expected to go into the family financial firm, Lehman Brothers, but instead was sent to Cambridge, to Trinity College, Cambridge, where he was intending to study economics as a background to entering finance. But they didn't have an economics tutor there, and they didn't think much of the economics tutor who was at King's, who he could have had, whose name happened to be Maynard Keynes. So then he became a lawyer, and after World War I, all the young academics had been slaughtered in the trenches in World War I, and his tutor, Harry Holland, asked my father if he would come back to Trinity, to Cambridge, to become a teacher of law, which he did, and stayed there ever after. Because we came from a Jewish family, though my father was not didn't practice, it was not a devout person in any way. The children, my parents stayed in England during the war, but my brothers and I were evacuated to the United States. So I did my kindergarten and indeed my postgraduate work. I topped and tailed in the USA. And actually, as I happened to be looking at your splendid award, I thought I would actually show you a picture of myself. We went to school in Tucson, Arizona. And here is a picture, my brother and I. I was then aged about 6 or 7. So it was a great pleasure, and so I feel that I got a number of connections with Frederick Heldring, both the Dutch connection and the banking connection. So it makes me doubly honoured and a really great pleasure indeed to have this splendid award. And so thank you very, very much for it. I shall treasure it and be one of the highlights of my career, which alas has got more of a history than a future given my age. So perhaps with that we'd better turn on to the subject matter of my latest, and I fear possibly my very last book. Though one of the things that I sometimes add at the end of my CV or bio is that I have written more books or articles on money and financial matters than any sane person would ever really want to read. So anyhow, can I start now with a presentation of the latest book that I've written with my splendid co-author, Dr. Manoj Pradhan.
Yes, I mean, you know, perhaps just before that, I'd like to take a couple of seconds to introduce him. But, you know, your story is essentially encapsulating, you know, this truly global citizen. So, you know, it's quite fascinating. You should write a book about it. But, you know, I'd like to introduce Dr. Manoj Pradhan, who is the founder of Talking Heads Macro, an independent macro research firm. And he was also a former Morgan Stanley's global macro, the head of the Morgan Stanley's macro team. He had joined Morgan Stanley back in 2005, and I believe that that's where the two of you met. And before that, Manoj was serving on the faculty of the George Washington University, as well as the State University of New York. Manoj does emerging markets as well as global economics, and he has a PhD in economics from George Washington University and a Master's of Finance from the London Business School. I'd like to also introduce Bill Kennedy, who is the GIC Vice Chair of Programming, and he will be moderating today's session after the presentation. And finally, a big thank you to GIC's members and friends who support today's event by purchasing a tribute of congratulations. The tribute book, you should have it in your email box. It has been sent to you electronically. But with no further delays, the virtual floor is yours, Professor Goodhart. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Kathleen. In our book, we actually state that demography and some reversal in the process of globalization will raise inflation in future. Over the last 30 years or so, from about 1990 to 2020, we've had very low and really very stable inflation. And indeed, the period from the end of the 1980s until the great financial crisis, the great moderation, was the best 15 years of the history of the world. A low, stable inflation, relatively stable and quite reasonably rapid growth. Millions of people were taken out of poverty. It was indeed a marvelous period. And a great deal of that, the stable inflation, the great moderation and so on, were due to the fact that the monetary regime of central bank independence and inflation targetry did work extremely well. And it was a splendid improvement in what had gone before. However, one of the points that we start with is that this was not solely due to the monetary regime, in the sense that the central banks did not have to work terribly hard to achieve low and stable inflation. They could do it while at the same time both nominal and real interest rates were trending downwards. And indeed, after the great financial crisis in 2008, 2009, although the central banks threw everything they could at trying to raise inflation back to target, it actually remained stubbornly somewhat below target, though not very much so. So there must have been something else as well that was providing a disinflationary context. And no doubt technology provided some of that. But we think that the major cause of the underlying disinflationary context was the process of globalization and demography. Now, on the left-hand side of this chart, the blue solid line represents the level over time, initially until 2010, the rate of growth of the working age population in the advanced economies of the world. North America, Europe, Australasia. Now, what occurred during the years from 1980 onwards was that two parts of the world, notably China, the most populous country in the world, together with Eastern Europe after the end and fall of the Iron Curtain, entered into the world's trading system. And their population, our working age population, was growing even faster and was greater than that of the advanced economies. And that is represented by the yellow line. So during these years, if you were in a position to move the production of manufactures or services or anything from a high wage economy in the blue area, in the advanced economies, to a low wage economy represented by the yellow line, the amount of labor that you could enjoy more than doubled over the course of 30 years. There's never been anything quite like the surge in the availability of labor during this period. And if something increases enormously in supply, what will happen will be that its relative cost will go down. So the ability to shift production from high wage to low wage economies, essentially from North America and Europe to China and Eastern Europe, meant that there were strong disinflationary forces. Not only was the production of manufactured goods shifting to China, becoming the workshop of the world, did that keep them relatively cheaper? But it meant that employers in the advanced economies had a credible threat to their workforce. Effectively, if you try and raise your wages too far, we will simply shift employment abroad. And the shift of manufacturing employment to China and Eastern Europe meant that in the advanced economies, the proportion of workers in manufacturing dropped really quite sharply and rose equivalently sharply in services. And the bargaining power of labor and their unionization is much higher in manufacturing than it is in labor. In manufacturing, there's a large number of people working under one roof, and they're easier to organize in labor unions than in services when they're split up into relatively small groups. On the right, you simply see the rise in the working age population year by year. But it was not only the rise in the working age population that became increasingly available, it was that those of working age population became a much larger proportion or significantly larger proportion of the total population. What was happening was that after the baby boom in 1945 through to 1955, the fertility rate dropped very sharply. If you could go back one, please. If you go back one. And so the proportion of young in the population of all the countries dropped really particularly sharply during the period from 1970 to 2010. And that dropped much more sharply than the number of retirees increased, with the exception of Japan. And that meant that the proportion of those of working age population grew quite sharply. But it was not only that, it was also that the proportion of those of working age population who actually became workers increased very sharply. And that arose in the same way as the decline in the birth rate and the decline in fertility, combined with the rise in the availability of consumer durables, washing machines, refrigerators, and so on, released the larger proportion of women of working age population from doing purely housework, which does not get included in GDP, in total measured production, though many people think it should be. And women shifted from doing housework to becoming part of the normal workforce. And that meant that half the work of those of working age population who hadn't been included in the workforce suddenly began to be included in the workforce. So there was an enormous shift during the years from 1980 onwards to an increase in the proportion of workers in the economy. And that too is strongly disinflationary in the sense that you will only pay a worker less than the expected value of their production. Otherwise, it wouldn't be feasible or sensible to hire them in the first place. Moreover, the workers have to save for their expected retirement, and that means that workers are almost by definition disinflationary, while the young and the old who consume but don't produce because they're retired in the case of the old, they haven't joined the workforce in the case of the young, consume but don't produce, so they are by definition inflationary. And it was during these years that you got an enormous proportion of the population, an increased proportion of those in the population becoming workers, and therefore a reduction in those who consumed but didn't produce in the population as a whole, and that was strictly disinflationary. Now this is changing and changing quite sharply as the proportion of young in the population remain fairly stable, with birth rates remaining constantly below the sustainability rate at about 1.7, 1.9 per woman, while the life expectancy continuously extends and the number of retirees rises, and the proportion of those in the oldest age groups, over 65, right through to 85, up to 100, are increasing faster than any other part of our population. And this is going to be expensive. It's going to be expensive because the old consume in practice in the advanced economies, rather more than those of working age and a great deal more than the young. Now, I'm old myself, and that does not mean that I'm actually consuming more in the way of goods and services. What we old consume is care, medicines, and we need to be looked after, because increasingly we cease to be able to undertake the activities of daily living without outside help. The medicine has been remarkably, wonderfully capable of doing splendid improvements in dealing with cardiovascular diseases and reducing the death rate from cancer. But so far it has had absolutely zero success in dealing with the neurodegenerative diseases, Parkinson's and dementia and so on, which incapacitate you, but don't kill you as quickly as that. And indeed, the likelihood that you need care and support increases almost exponentially as you get older. Your likelihood of having a neurodegenerative disease is about 1 in 3 between 65 and 75. Your need for care rises to about 1 in 2 between 75 and 85, and increases to almost 80% or more when you get over 85, and that is very expensive. And we haven't yet faced up to the problem of how we're going to look after the old, and the old are proportionately the fastest growing segment of our populations. So it's going to be an increasing burden. It's also going to be an increasing financial burden on the public sector. This chart from the Office of Budget Responsibility in the UK was consciously drawn from 2019, before anyone in the UK really had any appreciation or understanding of COVID. And what it effectively shows is that under present policies of retirement age, of care, of Medicare, of tax policies, of the decline in the working age population, and therefore the decline probably in the rate of overall growth, that fiscal primary deficits were likely to continue over the foreseeable future. And with that, the debt, public sector debt, was likely to rise exponentially. In other words, the debt problem, the debt overhang, was not a function of COVID. It is a function of the structural change, the aging of our society. And this is certainly true in the United States as well as in the UK. This is the latest Congressional Budget Office CBO projection of the public sector debt for the USA. As everybody knows, the debt ratio nowadays is high, but it's not significantly higher than it was after World War II. And indeed, in the UK, the debt ratio here is still well below that attained after the Napoleonic War and World War II. But wars are temporary, thank God. And after the wars were over, the state, the government during those earlier years, did not have any equivalent responsibility for looking after the retired, particularly the indigent retired, and those who needed care. And so the difficulty is that unlike the wars, where you expected the debt ratio to go down steadily after the war is over, under present policies, the debt ratio in the US, as in the UK, is likely to increase exponentially. You see the bump, the blip, where the pandemic, the COVID pandemic, is leading to a sudden, really very sharp increase in the debt ratio, which then tends to level off. But, and this I really want to emphasize, the subsequent upwards trend is in fact exactly the same now as it was before the COVID pandemic struck. In other words, the underlying problem that our societies face is how to deal with an aging structure of their population. So how are we going to deal with that? What's going to be the end game? Now, one of the problems is that the best way of dealing with debt, whether it's public sector or private sector, is to grow out of it. And the difficulty is that the structure of our population, demography, makes that extremely unlikely. It makes that extremely unlikely because overall growth is a function of the rate of growth of the working age population and the proportion of workers within that, interacting with the increase in productivity that they can bring about. And what we have in all countries is, in the advanced economies, is a decline in the rate of growth of the working age population. In many countries, notably and particularly in China, but also in Germany, in many countries in the European Union, not only Germany, but Italy, Spain, Austria, Scandinavia, I think France, the actual rate of growth of workers, of working age population, is actually going to decline. Now, of course, that might be offset by an increase in productivity, and productivity has been extremely disappointing in virtually every country over the last few years. Actually, I should have mentioned that the US and the UK, the demographic future is not so bleak. The rate of growth of the working age population in our countries is going to slow down considerably, but it's not actually going to decline. Now, productivity has been very disappointing, and we think it is going to recover. We think it's going to recover because the slowdown in the availability of workers, together with the reduction in globalization as a result of the economic conflict with China, and the effects of the COVID pandemic, which has led everyone to think that essential production such as vaccines and major pharmaceutical industry need to be kept onshore, so that the reversal of globalization is likely to lead to onshore investment rather than offshore investment. Moreover, the decline in the availability of labor is likely to mean that real wages will go up. And in order to hold unit labor costs down, we think that employers will invest more in our countries. Again, corporate investment has been disappointing in recent decades, and the greater investment in our countries will raise productivity. But we doubt very much whether the increase in productivity will be sufficient to offset the decline in the rate of growth of the working age population. Now, in those circumstances, in order to stabilize public sector debt, we think that taxation will have to go up. If you're going to pay out a lot more, and not only for the old, but for climate change and all the other desirable things on which the public sector wants to spend money, your President Biden has been indicating a lot of them, you're going to have to raise taxation. But the problem is that taxation is politically extraordinarily unlikely and difficult. Because it's politically, people who get taxed hate it so much. Now, there are various kinds of taxation that can be introduced, and the present government is introducing and raising taxation as we stand. But there is no tax that you can increase that is going to be other than politically strongly objected to. Even a tax that most economists think is desirable, such as a carbon tax. President Macron of France tried to introduce it, but he ran, of course, into the Gilets jaunes. If you live in the middle of the country, gas is essential. And if that is taxed, it has a very severe effect on your livelihood. And for every tax that people want to raise, I can think of a large number of political objections that will be pushed very strongly against it. And as a result, for political reasons, we think that taxation will not be raised sufficiently to deal with the increasing expenditure that will be needed, to deal with the Medicare and care requirements of the old. And again, you can try and raise the retirement age. That too is very unpopular. You might think that Mr. Putin, President Putin of Russia, has a stronger control over his country as any authoritarian, but even he ran into great difficulty in trying to raise the retirement age. It's politically very difficult. And again, Medicare and care for the aged is extremely politically popular and socially desirable. So that's going to be unlikely to be introduced. So you can try then to deal with the rising inflationary implications of all that by tightening monetary policy. But if you tighten monetary policy, raise interest rates, that has severe fiscal implications with the debt ratio being so high. And with private sector debt also being very high, an increase in interest rates is likely to lead to asset prices declining, possibly leading to a financial collapse, could lead to a recession, and that wouldn't help anyone. So it's going to be extremely difficult, much more difficult than central bankers are now saying. They're being very complacent in suggesting that should inflation take hold, they would be able to deal with it. It's very, very difficult to deal with inflation when you have such high debt ratios already outstanding in your own country. So no one wants inflation. Everyone will say that they don't want it. But it's possibly politically the least bad answer to the debt problems, the problems arising from the aging structure of our society that we currently see coming down the road. Now, we really didn't know when the reduction in the availability of labor in our economies, when the decline in globalization, when the turnaround in demography would actually shift the underlying context from being disinflationary to being inflationary. When asked sort of earlier on, before COVID, when this would happen, we said that within plus or minus 5 years, we really did not know. Because there's a great momentum. The bargaining power of labor has been very, very strongly reduced. Private sector trade unions are a mere shadow of what they were 20 or 30 years ago. Prime ministers and presidents used to take very seriously and deal very closely with trade union leaders like the union leaders of the UAW. Now they don't do it at all. And that it will take quite a long time for this to reverse as demography and globalization bring about a recovery in labor bargaining power. However, our uncertainty about when these underlying trends in demography and globalization would really so strengthen labor bargaining power that we would get a shift back to the inflationary context. Our uncertainty got really changed a lot because we think that the COVID pandemic will have an impact on the timing of our thesis, that the world is shifting from disinflation to a more inflationary underlying background. And I now will hand over to my colleague Manoj to take you through the reasons why we think this.
Thank you very much, Charles, and thank you to the GIC for having us here. Before I start, I wanted to add my 2 bits. You've seen that Charles is reluctant to talk much about himself and certainly not about all that he has done, but I'm going to take a few seconds. I have to say, easily the best experience of my professional career has been to work on this book with him. It's been an absolutely fantastic experience. And I am working every day that I can to make sure that his threat of not writing another book is not followed through upon. And it's an absolute pleasure. And I'm really glad that he's getting all the acknowledgement that he deserves. It's completely commensurate with the contributions that he has made to economics and the global economy. Right, and with that, let me proceed to take on the more cyclical and immediate part of our argument. As Charles said, inflation has long been regarded as a solution to the rising debt that we've seen, not just in the pandemic, but well before that as well. But it just hasn't been something that has been seen as a realistic solution, because how do you raise inflation after everything, including the kitchen sink, has been thrown in it? To the extent that most central banks now believe that the Phillips curve is for all practical purposes dead. And their models, when they include inflation expectations in the United States along with measures of the output gap or activity, certainly show you as much. However, our thesis is based on rethinking their line of attack. We argue that it's not the Federal Reserve that is responsible for killing the Phillips curve, as was put in an NPR interview in 2014, but actually it was China that put the Phillips curve into a coma. It's a topic of a forthcoming blog that you'll see from us, and the pandemic and demography are going to reverse it. If you look very briefly at the two charts I've got here, on the left-hand side, work from the St. Louis Fed shows you the coefficient on the Phillips curve, which suggests that the flatness of the Phillips curve started around the mid-90s. And the Phillips curve got flatter and flatter, suggesting that any improvement in growth was leading to a much slower increase in inflation until it got to a point where we couldn't really depend on better growth leading to any inflation at all. And the problem for that is, as Charles described, the 15 years before the pandemic were probably the best years for growth and the best years for inflation, but they came from sources that were not that did not originate in the United States. For example, this chart on the right-hand side from Andy Haldane's speech, Inflation, a Tiger by Its Tail, a lot of that decline in global inflation can be attributed to China and the demography that Charles has spoken about. So in a model of the US Phillips curve, you would see US inflation declining, US growth at pretty steady levels, and the Phillips curve show you a flatness, but you could not necessarily attribute that flattening Phillips curve to what was happening within the United States. It's a problem that we have attacked quite a few times, the willingness of most analysts to look at their particular economy in isolation, even though they think globally at the beginning of whatever models that they're portraying. Now, this is about to change because the pandemic is changing the entire backdrop for inflation. In 2020, even though it served our purpose, the main concern or the main question was, why didn't we get greater amount of deflation? This year, we're going to get a blip or a rise in inflation. Neither of those, last year's inflation or this year's inflation, are going to be the inflation way economists define it. Another chart from Haldane's speech shows you the breakdown of sectors by demand and inflation in the UK. So think of all of these diamonds at the origin between the blue and the pink squares in January 2020 before the pandemic begins. And then as the pandemic hits, they disperse into these two quadrants. The upper right-hand quadrant, obviously including supermarkets and food deliveries and Amazon, and the lower left-hand side showing you the retail sectors, restaurants and airlines. And almost all of the inflation that we've seen over here can be attributed to changes that we have in that upper left right-hand side in 2020. In 2021, the pink quadrant is going to normalize and lead to higher inflation. But what we have in mind is what happens in 2022, the exact time at which the Federal Reserve tells us that inflation is going to fall. Today, the two key models of inflation are suggesting completely opposite things. The Friedman model through monetary aggregates is telling us that inflation really looks like it's going to rise. Monetary aggregates today are higher in many economies than they've been for the last 35 years. And the output gap, the Phillips curve, is telling us that, well, actually inflation has no reason to rise right now because output gaps are negative. Both of these are being held back by the same factor. On the left-hand side, you see after a decline structurally in velocity because of financial globalization, the collapse in M2 velocity And on the right-hand side, you see the dramatic increase in household savings that have recently risen again as the second wave has hit the United States and then slowly started dissipating. They are both dynamics that can be explained by the fact that I think most of the people on this call will still be working from home. We're making our coffees at home. We've probably got takeaway more than restaurants on our menu. And that means a significant part of the economy is simply not seeing enough circulation. And that is also the reason that our pre-COVID income is more than enough to finance our COVID consumption basket, leading to a high personal force savings. Now, the question is, how do we deploy these? And if they do get deployed persistently into the housing market, which is an intermediate type of good, it is neither consumption nor investment, but a bit of both, the ability of these savings and rising velocity to push inflation up in the future is significantly higher. But let me just end the analysis by talking about one thing that we get asked, and it's actually the first chapter in the book that we wrote after a lot of work in which we believe we've added to the debate on Japan. Why didn't any of this happen in Japan? If our story is consistent, if it makes sense, we should have seen it happen in Japan. And the answer is actually no. The problem with analysis of the Japanese economy that says Japan's demography was deflationary is because almost every analysis of Japan, as I mentioned for the US, takes a look at Japanese demographics, takes a look at Japanese growth and inflation, and connects one with the other. In a globalized world, that is simply not true. China's demography and Japan's demography clashed. Japan started seeing a small labor force at the time that China was disinflating the rest of the world, and Japan simply had no way to stop it. What you see on the left-hand side is a fairly large amount of painstaking work taken from 20 years of Métis data. And that shows you that Japanese corporates were actually not burdened by the decline in corporate leverage as we imagine they are, but they were actually vibrant and dynamic. They understood the rise of China. They understood the rise of the increase of the labor supply, and they invested heavily abroad. They employed heavily, and they created a lot more of their profitability abroad, to the extent that Japanese overseas FDI was an escape valve for Japanese corporates taking advantage of global labor supply. But things are changing. Even though we think of Japan as having tried every experiment in the book to try and get out of deflation, that simply is not true in terms of magnitude. If you look at M2 on the right-hand side, you see that Japanese M2 has never gone above 5% in the last 35 to 40 years. Today, it is at 10. It's no surprise that Japanese break-even inflation has moved from minus 20 basis points to plus 20 basis points. So Japan is not really a template for the future, more than a function of being a part of the global demographic story that we have talked about, a story that has now changed completely, which means we can no longer see it as a roadmap. And in conclusion, I'll make 5 points. Number one, inflation is coming. Number two, the yield curve is likely to steepen because central banks will want to embolden the recovery and also be under political pressure to try and not kill the expansion. Number three, asset returns will be much harder to extract. Number four, the good news is productivity will rise and within country inequality will fall, but against a relatively difficult backdrop of low growth. And number five, the central bank independence that we have all taken for granted over the last 35 years will come into increasing conflict with the administration as central banks try and rein in inflation and administrations try and reduce the threat to growth and to financial stability as we go forward. With that, I'll stop here and turn it back to you, Bill. Thank you very much.
Charles, Goodhart, Manoj Pradhan, what a terrific piece of research. Thank you both. And Charles, let me say without question, yours was the best photograph we've ever shared on a GIC event. So thank you for sharing with us. So I'm delighted to moderate the Q&A portion of our program. Let me remind our audience that you can ask a question by using the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. So let me start while the questions are queuing up. The Great Demographic Revival, it really balances a conventional cyclical view of inflation with the structural factors, namely demographics, not solely demographics, but a heavy emphasis on demographics. Charles, can you just share what was the catalyst for you to create this research?
Well, we were, I think, really quite concerned about what were the reasons why we could combine very low inflation with expansionary monetary policy. We needed to give an explanation of that because we don't believe that everything depends on inflationary expectations. Central banks now put a great deal of weight on inflationary expectations. We tend to believe that the inflationary expectations tend to be more adaptive and backwards looking. And they're only well anchored because in the past inflation has been well anchored. So we don't think that inflationary expectations are the end all and be all. And so we were looking for another cause.
Terrific. Thank you for that. So we have a number of questions here that I think they fall into the yes, but what about category. You've addressed one, which is Japan. So I think we will we'll pass on that because Manoj, you gave a good explanation as to why the Japan experience has been different. But a GIC board member is asking, aging population plus slowing productivity equals slower potential GDP growth. If this is true, then why or how do we get rising inflation?
Well, that's not difficult. We get rising inflation because we have to spend a lot more money on looking after the old, and it's going to be politically very difficult to raise taxation sufficiently to pay for that, because we're going to be raising taxation on a smaller proportionate number of those who are actually working. Because it's actually not the scale of the problem is of the fiscal problem is sufficiently large that the idea that you can deal with all this taxation by simply taxing the wealthy just won't is not enough. Even if you put taxes on the wealthy high enough, what you would find would be massive outward migration of the wealthy to other countries. So there are limits to the degree that you can tax the wealthy. And any other form of taxation you like to name, I can describe why there will be very great political opposition to it. It's a political economy problem.
If you're thinking about economics 101 type of explanations, I think the answer is actually is a fairly simple one. What you see in a recession, the reason that we equate lower growth with lower inflation in a recession is completely the opposite, 180 degrees from what we are talking about when it comes to potential. In a recession, slower growth means that potential output is reasonably steady. You do get some destruction because capital destruction takes place and you don't replace all of the capital. But let's say potential output remains where it is and actual output in the economy falls to the left. So you get an opening up of an output gap, which creates slack in the economy, and that creates disinflation as the aggregate supply curve shifts downward. As the question itself says, lower growth and modest increases in productivity means that the potential output growth curve, if you will, that vertical one, is shifting to the left. So you're actually not creating a negative output gap. If anything, you're saying that lower growth and lower potential output growth imply a lower probability of a negative output gap opening, which is not disinflationary at all. So even from a very basic fundamental premise, the path that we're taking is not suggesting a disinflationary path. In fact, it's ruling it out. Let me give you the simple example of an economy today. Take a look at someone like South Africa, for example. They've had a decay of investment for the last 10 years. And that has meant that the output gap is much smaller, despite GDP growth being only 2% and 1.5%. which most of emerging markets seem to have these days, if the potential output growth was 3 and actual output was 1%, then you would get a disinflationary impulse. That is being seen in other emerging markets, but not in South Africa. So your question is not inconsistent with our call at all.
Thank you for that. So in the book's postscript, you contrast today's inflationary argument and environment with that period when quantitative easing was launched. Back then, there were a lot of fear and cries for inflation coming from QE, but it never materialized. Can you contrast and compare where we are today with the argument of inflation coming from QE, and why is this time different?
It's different because the initial introduction of QE was done, and very rightly done, because there was a liquidity panic. A lot of banks were fairly near to insolvency. There was a great fear about the solvency of the banks. And so when the Federal Reserve, quite rightly, started QE, it provided the liquidity that the banks all wanted. But they were drawing in their horns out of risk aversion, and subsequently because of tightening of regulation. And that meant that the QE at that time did not lead to a significant rise in money in the hands of the general public, households and firms. If you look at the broad monetary aggregates, you see that in virtually every country after the great financial crisis from 2008 through for the next few years, although base money and the reserves of the banking system increased dramatically, the broad money supply did not. It remained fairly low, both in the US and in the euro area. The difference this time is that QE has led to money going to the hands of the general public. The broad money supply, as Manoj actually showed in one of those diagrams in the US, is leading to an increase in the broader monetary aggregates, money in the hands of ordinary people, ordinary firms, rising at something like plus 25% per annum. And there's never been an equal to that outside of wartime. And it is really a dramatic increase in the availability of money, and as Manoj said, in savings that people have. And to the degree that normalization returns after the COVID pandemic gets defeated by the vaccination, some proportion of that, and nobody knows exactly what proportion, but some proportion of that will get spent on various services that we've not been able to enjoy for months, and as Manoj says, on housing. And that will drive up demand, expenditure, and ultimately this will lead to greater inflation as the economy recovers really very strongly and very sharply, with a number of other factors, higher commodity prices, higher minimum wages, higher unemployment benefits, strengthening the hands of labor, so that the increase in inflation it will not only be a blip, though there will be a post-pandemic blip for the reasons that Manoj said, but it's likely to be much more persistent. So it's a case of a difference in what the increase in base money has been used to achieve, or did achieve, in the two conditions that has been so important. I might add that for a very, very long time, I have been a very convinced opponent of what is known as the money multiplier analysis of the determination of the supply of money, which suggests that the rate of growth of base money is crucial for leading to monetary expansion. But it doesn't mean that even though the base money multiplier doesn't work, which I never believed in anyhow, that does not mean that the rate of growth of the monetary aggregates and the personal sector savings ratio will not have important further effects on demand, output, and inflation in our economies, but perhaps particularly in the United States, since your fiscal package and your monetary expansion has been so much more marked than in other countries, notably than in the euro area.
I'll add three small points to that. First, there is a matter of coincidence. It's really quite a thing that in 2019, the two main central banks of the world have had a review in their policies, and they have now switched to very different goalposts. The first part is that the Fed has switched from effectively inflation forecast targeting to ex-post inflation targeting, which means that whatever inflation has to happen will now be allowed to first take place before any action is taken. Second is monetary and fiscal policies have blurred the lines between each other quite a lot. Fiscal policy is becoming far more cyclical in nature. In an economic sense, we've had probably historically low levels of unemployment because there's been no loss of incomes, very little loss of consumption. And if you look at monetary policy, I think Lael Brainard's speeches from the first couple of months of the year show you very clearly, and Chair Powell has been very clear on this as well, about the inclusive growth, which means monetary policy is taking on redistributive aims, which, I mean, frankly, I don't even know how to contextualize those. And so in a sense, we are also at a turning point from Kenneth Rogoff's 1985 conservative central banker, where it certainly looks like the age of the liberal central banker has dawned. And if that is the case, then we're looking at a very different policy stance compared to the post-GFC period as well.
Thank you for that. We have several questions talking the future of globalization. And maybe I can ask you to tackle two questions. What's the path for globalization as we look forward under your thesis? But also globalization through immigration reduces the cost of care. Technology reduces the cost of healthcare. There's increased foreign savings that reduces the cost of financing the sovereign debt. And this participant is arguing that all of these are slow growth, low inflation results. So can you address globalization and then specifically the impact of globalization trends on healthcare costs?
Why did you start in this one, Manoj? You're mute, Manoj.
Sorry, Charles. I do think the globalization story is a lot more mixed. It's clear that some part of globalization has been hurt quite badly. If you look at even something as narrow as the strategies taken for vaccination for the global economy, I mean, on a very personal basis, my family itself has had positive tests back in India. And it's very clear that no matter what we do to the domestic economies in the advanced world, unless we spread the vaccination programs all over, these kind of changes in and mutations of the virus and so on and so forth are very likely to be with us for a very long period of time. But that kind of globalized thinking is simply not there. On the other hand, the global arbitrage is something that is being worked on. I very much approve of President Biden's plan to have a multinational approach to corporate taxation, because it really does get rid of some thorny questions. And so this is a two-track structure almost, where globalization is suffering on the one hand, with increasing political economy frictions coming in, and it is still ongoing on the other. I think the main question that shows up over here is an amalgam of two stories which include technology. One is a question that has kind of become an interesting one, which is that if you can do your work from home, maybe someone else can do your job from their home. So people who were previously employed in the advanced economies at high wages, perhaps there is more competition for them due to working from home phenomenon from others in different economies, which may have lower wage structures. And the second part of that is what happens to medical care. I think if you look at the American associations for doctors and nurses, they had a very, very, very clear message, and which we included in the book, that there's a dramatic shortage of doctors. And we've learned that about medical services in general during the crisis, especially when it comes to the coming healthcare story and the coming crisis of caring. Some of that can be offshore. You know, if you have a shortage of doctors, there is every chance that some of the more basic functions could be offshore to medical professionals elsewhere. But caring is incredibly, incredibly hard to offshore. So globalization may be able to deal with some parts of the services sector, but it's very difficult to think that it will have the kind of transformation that manufacturing did. And you'll be able to mass on offshore a lot of the services that are so idiosyncratic and so personally engaging. I mean, Charles and I, we've both been in academia for very different lengths of time, I must add very quickly. But even in our differential tenures, we've all heard that education is soon going to be offshore to online services. And some of that has happened. There are lots of online courses and online universities, in fact, but the enrollment for universities for in-person just simply does not die out. My niece, for example, deferred her MBA in the UK simply because she did not want to take online courses and miss out on an in-person experience. So I think there are limits to what we can do in terms of globalization, services, and medical treatment going forward from here, especially when you look at the wave of aging that is coming upon us.
Could I perhaps just add on migration, which is that, yes, it is technically feasible for those parts of the world where the growth in the working age population is still very strong and will remain strong for a number of years, which are notably Africa, India, and some parts of Latin America. The difficulty here is actually political, and that is that the ordinary worker, whether in the US or in Europe, is aware that globalization has weakened their overall position, that their ability to get higher wages significantly. And because you put much more weight in those things that you can see rather than those you can't, they tend to blame immigrants for their weakness in their bargaining position, a blame that I think is exaggerated, but for all that, it's still there. It was a huge impact on the UK vote for Brexit. The UK vote for Brexit was very largely a vote to keep the Hungarians and Bulgarians and Romanians out of the UK. I won't comment, since you're better placed than I am, to raise the question of President Trump's election was quite largely due to a fear of a continuing inflow of Mexicans. Well, if you raise that, how largely do you expect the coming crisis of caring to be met by allowing a very large influx of those from India and Africa to come into your country or come into my country? It's not an economic issue, it's a political issue. And we think that the ability of migration to solve the problems of an aging society will be stymied by the political unpopularity that will engender.
Great, thank you for that. Several questions here about the path of inflation. Let me see if I can't consolidate these into a single question. And first, I want to make sure your assumption is that we will have elevated inflation, not hyperinflation.
Yes.
I think that's correct.
Yes.
And Charles, you talked about the short-run blip, which I think is widely anticipated, certainly within the financial markets. Is the expectation then that it's transitory, it recedes back towards central bank targets, and then the structural inflation kicks in 2 to 3 years time? Or do we think that this move higher will be sustained over the next 2 to 3 years?
On the whole, we tend to think that it will be sustained. Let me just have a quick word about the scale of the blip. If the big number in front of the CPI remains below 4, the central bank, the Federal Reserve, and other central banks will declare victory. That's this coming year. If it goes, the big number is 4 but below 5, there will be a lot of discussion, but it won't affect policy at all, remain unchanged. If the big number goes to 5 or above, then there will start to be a lot of very serious and quite difficult and complex discussion about what we should do. That's the sort of the scale that one might think about the inflation numbers between now and perhaps this time next year. After that, the central banks feel that, or most of them tend to believe, that after this blip passes through, that inflation will go back steadily down to 2. For the reasons that Manoj was describing, we think that this is very unlikely in 2022 and 2023, not just because the trends in demography and globalization are reversing, but also because the scale of the fiscal and monetary expansion that has happened and will continue to happen over these next year or two, are going to make it very unlikely. Because, as Manoj put it, both the Friedmanite monetary sort of explanation of inflation and the Phillips curve pressure of demand, balance between demand and supply, output gap approach to the determination of inflation will still be on they will both be on the side of having greater inflation. So our view is that the central banks around the world, it's not only the Federal Reserve, but it's central banks more generally, are unduly complacent. It's not that we are saying that they ought to change their policies now. It's more that we are saying that beware, life is potentially going to become a great deal more difficult and perhaps a lot quicker than you think.
Just 2 quick points to add. One of the points that we try to make is the way housing will be treated. Charles has made the point in the past that, look, if you had included house prices in the some measure of inflation, then inflation numbers would have been significantly higher. If you include rents or an alternative, you saw what happened to the January print because of rents. We don't know if rents had remained subdued for good reason, which means people moving to other parts outside cities, or for bad reasons with coming delinquencies and oustings. It's hard to tell which one the story is, but the fact remains that how you deal with this is very important, because suppose you have a measure of housing that does not allow CPI to rise, it reduces the inflation threat in the data as far as the Federal Reserve is concerned, allows it to run its policies so that the economy runs hotter than it normally would have, and therefore tends to produce general overheating, but at a slightly later stage. So it's a matter of time, one way or the other, which way the inflation numbers show up, if the impulse is the right one. The second point I would add is that, look, this is the most synchronized global expansion we are likely to see in our lifetimes. At least I hope we will see, because that would mean that we don't ever see another pandemic of this type again. And really, it's very rare that in a crisis this deep, the cause of the crisis has some kind of a solution within a year and a half or 2. If you get a housing crisis or something that pushes the economy into such a deep recession, it takes 4 to 5 years to fix. And it's the other parts of the economy that policy tries to revive. Here, we are not getting that story. So in fact, in some senses, taking policy away at a relatively early stage should not be the wrong policy this time around. And yet, because of those reviews in 2019 for both the Fed and the ECB and the shifting of the goalposts that ensued, I think we're going to get a completely the opposite reaction. The Bank of Canada has changed things, but that's because of a greater fiscal impulse, similarly with China. But I think overall, the policy mix is also adding to some of the concerns that we've got about inflation.
Thank you. So we have about 5 minutes remaining in our program. Way more questions than we can get to, but let me just post maybe 2 or 3 questions. Manoj, this is for you. What indicator would cause you to change your mind about your thesis or declare that it's time for more research?
I think one of the things that would change our minds as far as our thesis is concerned, if we see, well, let's look at left field. If we see some change in medicine that allows elderly care or neurodegenerative diseases to be brought fairly quickly under control, one of the key reallocations in labor that Charles and I see is that because you can't have, or at least we don't think you can have AI and automation and robots look after the elderly, you need to have an increasing number of people from your domestic labor force without immigration reallocated to looking after the elderly. If that changes, either through technology or through medicine, then that reallocation of labor will no longer be necessary, and the jobs that are destroyed elsewhere within the economy will lead to an excess supply of labor. So you get a Stoper-Samuelson type of effect where one part of the economy through significant weakness then brings down the aggregate wage structure in the economy. That would be one, also through an increase in productivity. The second thing that would really allow us to change our minds is if you see debt being dealt with in a much more innovative fashion. So one of the things that we've written in our book on the chapter on how to resolve debt has been some kind of either forgiveness, which is a very disruptive story one way or the other, or alternate forms of finance, which is to look more at equity finance rather than debt finance, or to have instruments that pay coupons not just according to a fixed number, which is the prevalent interest rate regime at the time, but dependent on nominal GDP, so nominal GDP linked coupons. If some of these stories come up, then the importance of inflation in causing the real burden of debt to fall is significantly lower. You can just look at the UK, which has issued a significant number of inflation index bonds, to note that the effect of inflation on the debt, real debt burden over there will be much smaller than that in the United States. If those numbers change, then we'll have to think of a different thesis because it does weigh on us. But on all of them, on the first two, on technology and really medicine, we have absolutely no prism into the future. And in the second one, in terms of how debt is dealt with, Charles and I tend to think that it's probably going to take a crisis before such a large change in direction on how to deal with leverage takes place. It's not something that is considered to be an easy solution, otherwise it would have been already implemented by now.
Thank you. Charles, do you believe central banks have lost their independence? And is it even possible today to have a Volcker-style monetary response if we saw inflation move outside of the box from the central bank perspective?
I don't think they've lost their independence yet, except in some countries. I think they've lost their independence in India, Turkey. The most independent central bank by far is the European Central Bank, because it is protected by a treaty, and it would require unanimity among all EU countries to change it. In other countries, including your country and my own country, the independence is provided by an act of Congress, legislature. What one Congress does, another Congress can undo. What we think will happen will be greater clashes. And after all, over the last sort of 30 years, central bankers have been the best friends of ministers of finance because they've been reducing interest rates all the time. And that's politically wonderful. If inflation does start coming and interest rates have to start moving upwards, central bankers and ministers of finance will be in a position of a degree of conflict of incentives of what they want to achieve. And in the longer run, we think that the democratically or the autocratically elected Minister of Finance has stronger powers than the central bank chair or governor. So we think that there will be great pressure on central banks if and when interest rates have to start rising again.
Thank you. And finally, maybe a response from both of you. What's the one positive takeaway from your research and from the structural outlook that you've created? What do we have to look forward to over the next decade?
Well, waning inequality, and although inequality within the world has actually been falling since about 2010, under the influence of the very sharp rise in incomes in the very populous Asia, inequality within countries has also been increasing very sharply. And we think that that has been quite largely due to these demographic and globalization trends that we've been emphasizing. And with the shift in these trends, we think that within country inequality will be far less and will reduce. But that's, although the good outcome will be that the real wages of the of those in the lower quartiles of the income distribution will start increasing by more, the really rich will find life a great deal harder because, as Manoj said in our conclusions, asset returns, which have been magnificent for those who've got either human or financial capital over the last 30 years, will not be anything like as good over the next 30 years. Capital will be less proud, labor will be far stronger.
I think from my point of view, the best prospects for the global economy might be very different in certain key emerging market economies. Neither Charles nor I are great believers in the middle income trap, but we do believe there's an administrative trap. The rise of North Asia has broken that trap and pushed them into the advanced economy regions. And that's possible in some economies. For the first time in quite a few decades, the borrowing costs in emerging markets are now more or less in line with their real GDP growth, which means they don't have a negative carry for businesses at home. That actually gives them a reasonable shot at growth. What's more interesting is that, typically speaking, in the past, emerging markets have had to run significant current account deficits in order to attract capital and to raise productivity. If tech is right, a lot of the inefficiencies in emerging markets could be offset through what would be constructive technologies. The same things that are disrupting investment in the advanced economies could bypass a generation of capital in some emerging market economies, and that would push up potential growth faster. I don't think it's a panacea for the global economy as a whole, but it might be something that provides a considerable uplift if places like India, parts of South America, and even parts of Africa can get their act together. You're seeing the conditions for rising potential growth at least show up in some of them. The outlook isn't fantastic, but then market outlooks do tend to be backward looking rather than forward looking.
Thank you, Charles and Manoj, for joining us today. A real pleasure and delight to discuss your research in more detail. Dr. Goodhart, congratulations on being recognized for the impact of your life's work and what it's meant on monetary economics, and for receiving the Frederick Heldring Award for Global Leadership. Thank you very much.
Thank you, too. It was a great pleasure to be here. It was a great honor to receive that award. I really, really do appreciate it. Thank you very much indeed.
Good.
Thanks for including me on the program. I really enjoyed that. Congratulations, Charles.
Thank you, gentlemen. A reminder to our audience to find the replay of today's program, to order your own copy of The Great Demographic Revival, and I suggest you buy one now before inflation kicks in, or to explore becoming a member of the GIC. You can check things out at our website. That's Interdependence, www.interdependence.org. On behalf of Kathleen Stephenson and the GIC staff, we thank you for your attention. Thank you for joining us. Good day.